So we're joined here today, obviously, if you don't already know, the gentleman sitting to my left is Andrew Bacevich. He's a professor of History and International Relations at Boston University. He retired from the U.S. Army with the rank of colonel. He's the author, among other books, of The New American Militarism, and his writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic Monthly, The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. He's the recipient of a Lannan Award and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And those of you who read my review on Huffington Post, which also posted it on our website, will know that we're particularly looking forward to working with Professor Bacevich because he's a crossover intellectual. He appears in events like this, and he also appears on Fox News and writes for the American Conservative. So he has an opportunity to reach a broad cross-section of Americans with his critique of U.S. foreign policy, which is something that we desperately need if you look and see the dynamics in Washington. The format that we're going to follow today, Professor Bacevich is going to speak for a few minutes to introduce the topic, and then we're going to take your questions, which you submit through the website. My colleague Chelsea Mosen will be monitoring your questions and then reporting to them to us for Professor Bacevich to answer. So I encourage you not to be shy at all about peppering the website with your questions, and let Chelsea do the work of managing the traffic. So now I'll turn it over to Professor Bacevich to introduce our topic today.
Well, thanks very much for letting me participate in this event. We're going to talk, I think, about my new book, Washington Rules, subtitled America's Path to Permanent War. I'll try to briefly provide some understanding of what this book is all about. And I think I begin by wanting to make the point that for those who want to see change in foreign policy, a prerequisite is kind of get a bead on what foreign policy or national security policy has been about. There is a tendency, I think, encouraged by the way we think about our politics, to believe that national security policy changes significantly from one administration to the next. One of the arguments in the book is that's really not the case, that rather there is a pattern in our behavior in the realm of national security, a pattern in the way we think about our role in the world, a pattern in the way we think about what role military power should play. And it's a pattern that goes all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War, a pattern that has persisted and does persist down to the present moment. I'm going to describe that pattern in just a second, but a key preliminary point that I would want to make is that this pattern, these Washington rules, may well have served the nation's purposes at one time, back when they were conceived in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. That's no longer the case. These Washington rules purport to keep us safe. They purport to promote our prosperity. I think they're actually doing just the opposite. They are piling up animosity directed against the United States, and they're putting us on a road to bankruptcy. Well, what are the rules? I think they break into two major components. Component number one is a claim about the role that the United States is called upon to play in the world. And put simply, this American credo, as I call it in the book, is one that asserts that the United States and the United States alone is called upon to lead, save, liberate, transform the world. This is an idea that we can trace back to the founding of Anglo-America, John Winthrop's famous sermon of 1630, asserting that there was a covenant between America, this new world, and God, and that the purpose of that covenant was to create what Winthrop called a city upon a hill. Different politicians and writers have used different terminology at different times in our history, but this basic idea that we are unique and that we are chosen I think is a persistent theme that exists down to the present day. The second half of the Washington Rules, in the book I call it the Sacred Trinity, really relates to how Americans since World War II have gone about trying to fulfill the demands of this American credo. And the way they've gone about it is to emphasize in particular the role of military power. And military power applied in a particular way. This sacred trinity, of which is a playbook in a sense, consists of three parts. Part number one is the insistence that the United States, and of course the United States again exclusively, should maintain a global military presence. The second part is one that says that we should configure our forces not to defend the country in particular, but to fashion instruments of power projection. And then the third piece of this trinity is one that marries global presence to global power projection capabilities to support policies of global interventionism. These Washington Rules, I think, constitute the basic way that the United States has attempted to police the American century. They're not working. They need to be scrapped and replaced. Step number one in scrapping them and replacing them is to recognize their existence and their persistence and their defects. The purpose of this book is to invite Americans to understand what the Washington Rules consist of and why they don't work. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's a very good introduction to the topic, I think. Again, I encourage those watching to pepper us with your questions. I'll start things off by asking you, for many of our members, obviously, I think it's safe to say the most salient contemporary example of the phenomena that you're describing is the war in Afghanistan. This is
Right.
Something that we talk with our members a lot about, asking them to support things like the Feingold McGovern bill, trying to get the president to establish a timetable for military withdrawal, and it's something that in the news just this week. We have the new book coming out by Bob Woodward, where
Right.
he talks about the internal debate.
Mm-hmm.
So tailor your argument, if you will, to specifically the war in Afghanistan,
Sure.
how the debate that we're seeing is reflecting those rules, and what isn't being reflected about the underlying assumptions that all the people in the debate are apparently sharing.
Yeah, I think first of all, you're right that I think Afghanistan really provides an excellent illustrative case of the problem. Let's back up just about 2 steps. When Barack Obama ran for the presidency, I think much of the initial enthusiasm about his candidacy derived from a belief that this candidate who promised change, of course all candidates promise change, but that somehow this candidate's promise of change was different. The cornerstone of that campaign, at least at the outset, was that he was the one candidate among those deemed to have a chance of winning who had stood foursquare against the Iraq War from the outset. I remember that the aspirations of people like Senator Hillary Clinton were tainted by the fact that she had voted for the resolution authorizing the war. Obama was different. Obama seemed to be a figure who could, as he promised, change the way Washington works. And the assumption, I think, in some quarters was changing the way Washington works certainly would include foreign policy and national security policy. Now, also remember that during the campaign, Obama did say that Iraq may be the bad war, but Afghanistan is a good war. Elect me president, I will stand strong against the threat of terrorism, and Afghanistan is the place to make a stand. He said that. I personally think that many people who were listening to him, who sympathized with his candidacy, believed that when he said that, it was a campaign tactic intended to protect him from the charge of being a national security wimp. That he needed to try to do that to be at once the anti-Iraq war candidate, but not be looked as somebody who was too dovish to be trustworthy. Well, he wins the election. His ascendancy to the presidency brings these just enormous expectations of the change that he will bring about. And in the realm of national security during that first year of his presidency, the question of what he will do about Afghanistan kind of becomes item number one on the agenda. He deliberates for a long time. Matter of fact, he's criticized for deliberating too long. And it's not until December of 2009 that he finally yields his decision. And the decision is to prolong and to escalate the U.S. war in Afghanistan. Well, how does that illustrate the Washington rules? I think in a couple of ways. Maybe the most important, and this is reflected in what we are hearing about this Bob Woodward book that is about to be published. The Afghanistan decision reflects the persistence of this national security consensus in that it now appears the real decision was made by somebody other than the president. Or to put it another way, the decision that the president was invited to make was a peripheral one. In essence, it appears, the president was told, there's three choices, Mr. President. The first one is a surge of 20,000 troops. The second is a surge of 30,000 troops. And the third one is a surge of 40,000 troops. Please render your ruling. And the president, not unlike Goldilocks and the Three Bears,
Took the middle.
Took the middle option, and quite frankly is now saddled with the consequences. And we say, how can it be that this agent of change could have been maneuvered into a position where the options which he himself was presented with were so narrow, which was sort of excluded the larger question of whether we should be in Afghanistan in the first place. Well, we don't know all the details of how that process played itself out, but I think it's pretty evident that institutions with an interest in maintaining the status quo were able to control that debate, such as it was, in order to severely limit the choices made available to the president, with consequences that we now see before us, that the longest war in America will continue for some additional considerable period of time, and the rationale for this war becomes increasingly difficult to discern.
I understand we have 2 questions waiting. Joe?
We actually have 4 questions.
Oh, wonderful.
Waiting. Don in Silver Spring would like to know, do you consider the kind of warfare the U.S. prepared for with the USSR in Europe to be totally obsolete in today's world?
Well, 2 points. To the extent that that war was one that envisioned very large-scale conventional combat, in combat between the conventional forces of NATO pitted against the conventional forces of this enormous adversary, the Warsaw Pact. That's probably not going to happen anytime in our lifetime. To the extent that on both sides there was either an expectation or a fear that the conventional combat would lead to nuclear exchanges. I hope that that has become an unlikely prospect. To the extent that the real essence of NATO's policy with respect to the Warsaw Pact was not to go pick a fight, was not to try to have the war happen, but was actually to prevent war, to deter, to dissuade the Soviet Union from attacking, then it seems to me that concept is not obsolete. That the idea of adequate strength used to restrain, not to provoke, the notion that military power perhaps is best employed when it's held in abeyance rather than unleashed. Those are ideas that I think have continuing value.
Next question. Okay. John Orbital in Chicago would like Professor Bacevich to speak to the moral implications of endless war, moral implications for our leadership as well as for individual U.S. citizens.
Well, I think there's a couple things to be said here. The first is that the American people are almost willfully oblivious to the moral implications. Not least among those implications, I think, is that given our abandonment of the citizen-soldier concept, given our reliance now on a professional army, the reality of endless war is that a small number of our fellow citizens are told to cycle back to the combat zone time and time and time again. So the burden of service and sacrifice is by no means evenly shared. And one has to ask from the perspective of fairness or of democratic practice how that could possibly be viewed as acceptable. I think there's another moral issue, and the issue is that this war is not free. We have trillion-dollar deficits. We've got a national debt that's now over $13 trillion. The war is being waged in the name of the present generation. The cost of those wars is being passed off to future generations, with implications that nobody can clearly forecast, but they're not likely to be good implications. One ought to consider that this too is not moral, it's not right, it's not fair, it's not just. That deserves more attention, I think, than it's been getting.
Okay. Tom Hayden asks you to please elaborate on long war.
Well, long war has become a term of art in the Pentagon that has replaced the discredited phrase global war on terror. When the Bush administration launched its military enterprise in the wake of 9/11, global war on terror was the official, I think, term that was used to describe the larger enterprise. What bound Afghanistan to Iraq was that they were both campaigns in this global war on terror. I think the global war on terror as an idea had already fallen out of favor even when George W. Bush was still president. Certainly after President Obama assumed office, that term vanished, it disappeared. Long war is a term that the Pentagon has devised to replace global war on terror. It is the phrase that attempts to explain what Iraq has to do with Afghanistan, has to do with Pakistan, has to do with Yemen. I don't believe that the politicians have adopted this term. We don't hear President Obama or Secretary Clinton, to my knowledge, we don't hear them referring to the long war. But in military circles, that term is commonplace. And I think it's quite revealing. In other words, the one identifying characteristic, as far as the Pentagon is concerned, of this struggle is its duration. We're not saying where the war occurs or what the war is about What we're saying is this is a war that's going to go on for a long, long time. In that Woodward book, if we go by press reports, General Petraeus, the commander in Afghanistan, is quoted as saying, "This is a war that cannot be won." Now, it's not clear to me whether in that quotation Petraeus is referring to Afghanistan specifically or whether he's referring to the long war more generally. But he's quoted as saying, "This war cannot be won, but it is a fight that will go on for the length of our lives and probably for our children's lives." So when people in the Pentagon say long war, they don't just mean, from now until next summer. They expect that the war will continue for, quite literally, decades. And so the subtitle of my book, America's Path to Permanent War, may seem like it's provocative. I don't really intend it to be, well, I hope it is provocative, but it's also, I think, reflective, fairly accurately reflective of the military's own expectations for how long this struggle is going to continue.
So this is a question from a little bit earlier. It's from Chris Rushlaw. I'm not sure where he or she is. The question is, the question raised by this new trinity, etc., is whether this is an elite phenomenon or does the U.S. public buy into this credo?
Well, it's not new, it's old. I think that the credo and the trinity were created, promulgated at the beginning of the Cold War since the 1940s. They continue to exist today. Elites have emphatically embraced both the credo and the trinity. I think tacitly the American people have embraced them. The American people have been conditioned to believe, for example, that having a U.S. military presence scattered around the globe is simply something that is in the natural course of things. We take it for granted that 65 years after the end of World War II, there's U.S. forces still in Germany. What's the big deal? I think that members of your generation, who you were probably adolescents, if that, when 9/11 occurred, members of your generation have come to accept that there is nothing unusual in the fact that U.S. forces are engaged in combat, because in many respects, U.S. forces have been engaged in combat virtually since you became politically conscious. So it's not that the American people have been asked to consider the Washington rules and to rule on them. It's that we've come to accept it as kind of part of the wallpaper, of the national wallpaper.
So Norm Simon wants to know if there is any historical precedent for this outsized role we've taken on for ourselves.
Well, the historical precedents are of the great empires of world history. There was a time when Great Britain had a global military presence. There was a time when, albeit in a somewhat smaller world, Rome had a global presence. When Rome engaged in power projection, when Rome intervened. And I emphasize that because I think it's important for us to recognize that, and it's not that the American Empire is identical to or even all that much like the Roman Empire or the British Empire, but this kind of behavior needs to be seen as imperial behavior. And if we don't like that, the antidote is not to say, oh no, shout at the top of our lungs, oh no, we're not an empire. I think the antidote is to then reconsider the policies and to contemplate the possibility that there may be other choices to be made that can set us off in a more sensible course.
Norm has a follow-up question. Does this role take on a life of its own as other powers rise to challenge our leadership?
Well, it takes on a life of its own because institutions develop, rise up, grow, that are invested in maintaining the status quo. And when we talk about the national security state, that's something that didn't exist before World War II, emerged at the beginning of the Cold War, has a mammoth presence in Washington, D.C. The institutions that comprise the national security state, whether we're talking about the military or intelligence agencies, even if we're talking about sort of satellite institutions like the various think tanks in Washington, they are completely devoted to maintaining this pattern of behavior. The military-industrial complex, an array of corporate entities that make money as a consequence of the Washington rules. They are devoted to their perpetuation. So I think it's the emergence of domestic constituencies that are invested in ensuring that the way we do business continues to be the way we do business. That's what lends to the Washington rules the permanence that they seem to have acquired.
I have two questions that are about the same. Z Graphics ask, how do we stop endless war? And Caroline MSS wants to know, how can we help Americans see that our role in the world is not policeman, but rather empire? That is our real outsized role.
Well, we need to come to recognize the negative consequences of doing what we're doing. And that's actually saying quite a lot, given the fact that Americans don't serve and sacrifice. At least only a small percentage of Americans serve and sacrifice. Given the fact that we don't pay for the wars, it's easy for us to think that, well, yes, it may be regrettable that we're in the 10th year of a war in Afghanistan, but what does that have to do with me? Does it really matter all that much? So if we had a skin in the game, as it were, then there might be a greater demand for accountability and a greater demand for a real debate over alternatives.
So John Orbital from Chicago would like to know, given the vested interest in endless war, do you see the United States military officer class rebelling against the long war, endless war assumptions?
Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that that's going to happen. Now, this is an interesting point. The officer corps in which I served, this is the post-Vietnam officer corps, was emphatically devoted to the notion that the American military should not be committed to long wars. It was emphatically committed to the notion that war should be infrequent, and when conducted, should be conducted in such a way that they would end quickly and decisively. Recall General Colin Powell's doctrine of overwhelming force. One of the paradoxical things that's happened since 9/11 and the beginning of the long war is that the present-day leadership of the American military has not only abandoned the doctrine of overwhelming force, but basically has given up on the notion that war can serve as an instrument of decision. That victory is not really plausible. And that, in that sense, long wars define the wars of the future. And to a considerable extent, senior military leaders seem to be willing to accommodate themselves to that prospect. I find that almost bizarre, but that's the case. I do get a considerable number of emails from younger serving officers who have read something or other that I've written, and their comments, these are captains and majors, seem to suggest that at least to some degree in the ranks there is an awareness of the fact that long wars are not in the interests of the military profession. But it's impossible for me to say whether or not those expressions of opinion represent a small minority or a growing group. I can't tell.
Monica in Washington, D.C. wants to know if you believe that the war on drugs fits into this idea of endless war, and if you could elaborate on it. She further clarifies she's talking about the war on drugs in Latin America, and especially the Merida initiative in Mexico.
I don't know anything about the Amarita initiative, but I guess I would not want to press the comparison between the war on drugs and what we have been referring to as the long war. I would say that the war on drugs certainly has been a war that's gone on for a long time, and it's not winnable, and it's not going to be won. There too, the need for fresh thinking would appear to be great, and the barriers to fresh thinking are very great indeed.
Okay. Carolyn MSS says she's very concerned about the activities of special forces in Iraq. See Nation, June 2nd, 2009. Also being reported in Afghanistan in this week's news. This goes very consistently with targeted drone killing, and I guess she would like you to elaborate on that.
Well, I think to the extent that President Obama has brought change in the conduct of the long war, that the change relates to this issue. I do think that the president, despite his decision to escalate Afghanistan, is not looking for another country to invade and occupy so that he can try to change it. What the administration is opting for instead is what some call the counterterrorism approach, which emphasizes the use of force on a smaller scale to try to, if not eliminate, at least trip organizations like Al-Qaeda and Taliban. The weapon of choice appears to be the missile-carrying UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle. But what we've learned this week is that through the CIA, we're also arming proxy armies, Afghan armies that then operate in Pakistan, for example. And I think there's one big question about this approach has to do with how precise our operations are. You know, if we could say with a high level of assurance that whenever we fire a missile, or whenever we send this Afghan proxy army into Pakistan to go chase down some Taliban operative, if we could say with a high level of confidence that whenever we kill somebody, we're killing a real bad guy, then you might say it sounds like a pretty good approach. If, however, and this actually does seem to be the case, we're also killing some number of non-combatants, then it may not be such a good approach. Because the killing of non-combatants, I think by everybody's estimation, elicits a backlash. It produces anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, and therefore plays into the hands of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, who are able to exploit this anger, which we ought to understand, to their own advantages. But from our perspective, I mean, at our distance from the field, I think it's very difficult for us to evaluate who's actually being killed, and therefore whether or not this Obama preferred counterterrorism approach makes sense or doesn't make sense.
If I could follow up on that, isn't that the result of policy? Isn't there a deliberate or willful effort to obscure that? It seems like, reading the reporting of Gareth Porter, for example, from Afghanistan, that a lot of the claims that, you know, we killed X number, our forces killed X number of Taliban insurgents, later investigation seems to indicate that a lot of those people were non-combatants.
I think almost for certain the military itself and the administration are going to put the most favorable gloss on this that they possibly can. And they're going to say, and I don't think they're lying through their teeth, they're going to say we're doing our very best to try to target the right people. I think that they are completely truthful when they say that we don't just go flinging missiles wherever we want to. But we should always be mindful of the extent to which fog and friction, to use Clausewitz's terms, are endemic in warfare. Things do go wrong. It is very difficult to see clearly the battlefield, both in a physical sense and in an other than physical sense. So I think there's no question that our counterterrorism efforts fall short of a standard of perfection that would be everybody we kill is a bad guy. But I don't know how far short of that standard we fall. And it's very difficult for us to know because these operations are basically conducted in ways in which there's little visibility and therefore accountability becomes difficult to assert.
So Cole Harrison from Massachusetts Peace Action would like to ask you to evaluate the Afghanistan Study Group's proposal to de-escalate but keep 30,000 troops in Afghanistan.
You know, I probably can't comment because although I glanced at that report, I didn't really take it all on board. My own belief is that we don't have the capability to determine the future of Afghanistan, that the people of Afghanistan at the end of the day are going to do that. So we shouldn't kid ourselves. I favor withdrawal. It doesn't follow that I favor withdrawal by next Tuesday. You know, that'll be done in a responsible and a phased way, and I would be happy to listen to a field commander's views about how long it ought to take to do that. But I think getting out ultimately is what makes sense here.
Great. Bradley Craig would like to know, how do U.S.-Israel relations fit within the new trinity that you propose replace the American credo?
Well, I don't know how they fit. I think that recognizing that Israel has an unquestionable right to exist, Israel has an unquestionable right to provide for its own security. Israel faces some security threats. Yet all of that said, I think that it's time for us to recognize that on some important matters, U.S. interests and Israeli interests do not align. Matter of fact, on some matters, such as the urgency of settling the Palestinian problem, our interests diverge quite sharply. I think it's very important from a U.S. perspective to settle the Palestinian problem, because doing so will be one way of removing any claim on the part of the jihadists that there's some moral justification for their actions directed against the West and directed against us, that somehow terrorism is justified, they argue, because the West is complicit in punishing the Palestinian people or denying them their right to self-determination. I mean, the argument's a preposterous one, but nonetheless it's an argument that they make, and to some degree may help the jihadists, the violent jihadists, to posture that there's some justification for their actions. There is none. We need to strip that moral argument away. Quite frankly, I think from an Israeli perspective, there is no particular urgency in settling the Palestinian problem. The Palestinian problem, from an Israeli perspective, is a bit of an annoyance, but not much more than that. from an Israeli perspective, dealing with simply the problem of the settlements is an enormously difficult issue from their domestic political point of view. What are you gonna do with these settlements? You're gonna dismantle them, or are you gonna let these citizens of Israel suddenly become citizens of a Palestinian state? So we have an urgency to deal with this, they don't. And quite frankly, I think at this point, we should acknowledge that. And we should drop the pretense that somehow the U.S. and Israel are joined at the hip on anything that pertains to security, because it's not the case.
Great. Patty SD would like to know, what effects on American foreign policy do you anticipate as the result of information being made public by WikiLeaks?
Well, so far, not much. I guess there are supposedly some WikiLeaks bombshells that haven't been dropped yet. We'll see what they are. The release of the whatever it was, 90,000 or 80,000 documents from the Afghanistan war provoked a great deal of controversy, but I don't think it had any impact on policy.
So Andrew in Akron, Pennsylvania, says he has many friends and family who are cheerleaders for American empire and all things military and interventionism. He would like to know what a good question is that would give them pause for once.
I think, what does it cost, and who's paying?
Sounds like a good question.
Okay.
All right. John in Chicago says, as a teacher, do you think the current college-age generation has a better awareness and understanding of the consequences of endless war than their boomer generation parents?
I don't know. I do think that the students that I teach have a great interest in the world. I mean, their vantage point is one that looks outward rather than looking inward. I think that they are concerned and even troubled, perhaps, by the direction that U.S. policy has taken. Again, though, most of them, except for the ones that are in ROTC, are insulated from the immediate effects of permanent war. And I think that to some degree may limit the extent to which they feel engaged by these matters.
Okay. Z Graphics would like to know what the idea behind the cover of the book is.
You would have to ask the designer of the cover. I was just shown the design and asked what I thought, and I said, looks pretty good to me.
That's a good reason. Okay. Chris Rushlaw asked, what about racism in the U.S. military, symbolized by the use of the term Haji? Please explain the term's use in Iraq and, I'm told recently, in Afghanistan. That's Chris in Portland, Maine.
I can't explain that. I do think that there is a recurring tendency, I think, in conflicts to import into the image of the adversary and indeed of the image of the people among whom the war is occurring, to create images which are demeaning. This was very much the case in the Vietnam War in which I served. And Vietnamese were commonly referred to as gooks, to include not simply the NVA and the VC, but the Vietnamese people among whom we existed. And it did reflect a certain amount of contempt for them as human beings. And it's not something that's wrong, it is wrong, but also it's something that I think really can become a barrier to effectiveness. We have a scandal that has been unfolding for the last couple of weeks, really doesn't get nearly as much, I think, press play as it ought to, of an American unit, platoon. It's a small unit, that's like 30, 40 people, that apparently, allegedly, engaged in the killing of Afghan civilians for the fun of it. And I think that when an army develops this image of the people as inferior, worthy of disdain or contempt, that's the kind of thing that can happen. And again, I would emphasize, it's not simply that that's wrong, it's murder, it is murder, but that's precisely the behavior that very much gets in the way of these aspirations of counterinsurgent advocates that we're going to win the hearts and minds of the people.
Okay. Back to Don in Silver Spring. He would like to know if it's reasonable to expect for Japan and Germany to shoulder more of the burden for world peace so that we can reduce our immense military.
Well, I think only if we tell them that we expect them to do so. And I don't mean, again, it's not the matter we call them on the phone today and they'll respond tomorrow. But I think more in the case of the European countries than in the case of Japan and others in Asia. European countries are more than capable of managing their own security affairs. They are stable, they are democratic, they are rich, and they are deeply in the habit of allowing the United States to bear the burden for their security. And we need to say that that arrangement now is coming to an end, again, in a reasonable period of time. And they need to figure it out. And I think they probably could figure it out. But we have to insist that they're going to figure it out.
Is there a flip side of that? Is it merely that, these Europeans are slackers and they're getting a free ride? Or is it also the case that there are people in Washington that want to preserve the present arrangements?
Oh,
because they think
emphatically.
they get something out of it?
Emphatically. I mean, I think that there are people in Washington who cannot imagine that the world can exist without NATO, and without NATO with an American supreme allied commander, and that any suggestion that those sorts of arrangements should be reconsidered is rank heresy. Yes, there are people and institutions that are deeply invested in maintaining the status quo.
Sea Canary, Don in Silver Spring, ask again, so you don't see any threat in rearming Germany and Japan?
Well, you'll notice that when I answered the question, I emphasized Germany, and the answer is no, I don't. I do think that Japan is a somewhat different situation, and in my sequence of trying to reduce American commitments abroad, I'd start with Europe, and I wouldn't start with Asia. I think you can make a case that the U.S. presence in Asia probably at the moment contributes to stability because whether they will admit it or not, the Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese all benefit from the U.S. presence. The U.S. presence helps to prevent an Asian arms race, and that's good for the Asians and it's good for us.
Okay. Jake D. from LA wants to know how can veterans, I assume he's a veteran from the question, how can us veterans keep our patriotism while criticizing the wars at a time while so many other vets push for more troops?
Well, I think as Americans, we are called upon to do what we think we're supposed to do. We should exercise our right to free speech. We should not be intimidated by someone who claims that it's somehow unpatriotic to question or criticize the policies of the government in Washington. I would have thought that question had been settled long ago. So don't be intimidated.
Okay, so we have time for, I think, one more question. It's 4:26. Bradley Craig asks, what actions would you recommend we take to promote the new Trinity? How can we have a meaningful impact in changing the Washington rules?
I don't know if I have any great ideas. I mean, there are some people who feel drawn to be activists, engage in organizing. If that's what you think your role is, go do that. There are others who, for whatever reason, wish to play a quieter role in fulfilling what they see as their responsibilities as citizens. Well, whatever you think your role is, do it. If we all just tried to be good citizens, I think that there would be greater accountability, and there would be greater restraint imposed on people in Washington who wish to preserve the Washington rules, even if they don't work.
One quick follow-up. Owen in Chicago wants to know what you consider the most trusted sources we should be listening to in order to stay engaged and aware of what's actually going on among those in power in Washington.
No, I think you need to read the mainstream media, but you need to read the mainstream media. You need to bring a certain amount of skepticism to what you read in the New York Times and the Washington Post. But you need to read the New York Times and the Washington Post. Just don't take it all as gospel, and recognize the extent to which whatever the value of what is there, what is equally instructive is what is not there. And so you need to be an educated and skeptical consumer of the news.
That's all the questions for today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone that made this event possible. Professor Bacevich for sharing his time, Henry Holt for giving us this space and helping us put this event together, my colleague Chelsea Mosen for fielding your questions, Megan Yorio behind the camera. I hope that you have found this helpful and productive and will want to participate in such events in the future. I hope you'll read the book if you haven't already, and share it with your friends, particularly if you know any Republicans that aren't listening to your arguments. Maybe this book will do the trick in helping them think about the permanent wars in a new way. And thank you for joining us. Do please make a contribution via the website if you're capable of doing that, so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you on the internet.